Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this talk. My name is Anna. I'm with the Santa Fe Public Library, and we are partnering tonight with Little Globe. We started a project called Neighborhood Historians, and we've been putting on workshops and tonight this great talk to talk about what it means to get out into your community and collect stories. I first wanted to start and say that we do have Spanish language interpretation. If you go down to the bottom of your screen, it says interpretation and you can choose to toggle between English and Spanish. Tenemos interpretación disponible en la parte inferior de la pantalla si hace clic en el icono de interpretación. So tonight we are joined with Dr. Estevan Rael-Gálvez with Little Globe in conversation. I wanted to point out some of our partners and sponsors. Some of our sponsors are the New Mexico Humanities Council and the Northern Rio Grande National Heritage Area. And our partners are Earth Care, Manitos Community Memory Project, and of course, Santa Fe Public Library and Little Globe. Before we get started, I just wanted to tell everyone about a couple of events that are coming up. The Neighborhood Historians Project that we have going on right now. We have a December workshop. It will be online December 11th from 1 to 4. The registration should be in our chat box, or you can check out the Santa Fe Public Library website. We also have coming up, there's a Midtown conversation about the Fogelson Library and the Midtown campus and what that looks like for the future of Santa Fe and Santa Fe Public Libraries. It will be online November 30th at 5:30. And there is also a survey that you can take, and we should have that link also in the chat box. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Little Globe. Katie, take it away.
Thank you, Anna. My name is Katie Gross. I'm one of the co-directors at Little Globe along with Chris Jonas. I'll be introducing him in a bit. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're really excited to host this conversation. And I'll just give you a little bit of background about Little Globe in case you don't know who we are and more about the project. So Little Globe is an arts nonprofit based here in Santa Fe, and we are made up of artists, musicians, filmmakers, photographers, facilitators, educators, and cultural workers. We believe that communities thrive when everyone is seen and heard. And we collaborate with organizations, institutions, and community members in storytelling and creative multi-arts projects to create spaces where people can share their personal experiences and feel seen and heard. This Neighborhood Historians Project is actually one part of a broader project called Presente. And we started Presente in 2018 with Dr. Estevan Rael-Gálvez. And Presente is a story-based multi-arts project that explores personal reflections on belonging, gentrification, and displacement in Santa Fe. And in this project, we collect and co-author stories with community members about these issues and amplify these stories through events and broadcasts. So the Neighborhood Historians Project is a pilot story-based neighborhood project based here in Santa Fe, and came about because of a project that they're doing with the Menitos Community Memory Project. And in this project, we are working in collaboration with residents, families, neighborhoods, and community-based organizations, public libraries, schools, and the city of Santa Fe to share the tools of multimedia storytelling to the diverse people who live here. Participants in the Neighborhood Historians program will be trained in audio and video tools to gather, edit, and archive the stories of neighborhood residents. So we are in the beginning phases of this project doing workshops, and we will soon be having an application and a formal process for inviting people. We are offering 5 positions who will be paid stipends of $500 to gather and edit an oral history-based video. The Santa Fe Public Libraries will also be offering 5 positions with $500 stipends to gather and then archive oral histories. Applicants can apply to both programs and make a combined $1,000 stipend, conducting oral histories, creating a short film, and archiving stories. So we're very excited to be piloting this project and inviting community members to help us iterate this project as we move into the Presente project. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Chris Jonas, a co-director at Little Globe, and he will move to the next part. So here's Chris.
Thank you, Katie, and welcome everybody. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be sitting here virtually next to the marvelous Estevan Rael-Gálvez, who in many ways I don't think Little Globe would exist without him and his perspectives on how story and community interact in a way that's quite different than the way it's oftentimes held. And so I'm thrilled to be here, and traditionally, of course, for something like this, I would provide you with a formal reading of Esteban's bio, but instead, I think what we're going to do is kind of consistent with the way that we are trying to operate as an organization and as a project, is to let Esteban tell his own story. And the evening tonight will not be a formal lecture conversation kind of a thing. It will be a conversation between Esteban and myself. We have some questions that he and I have worked on, and we're just going to have a dialogue. We're going to talk for a while, and then we'll have a Q&A with the audience. And again, there's a couple of different ways that the Q&A will take place at that point. You can, I think there's a Q&A button you can push. You will be able to push, and you can enter a question there, or alternatively, you can raise your hand, and then we will unmute you, and you can ask your question via Zoom. But that's going to be on the other side of this conversation. So let's get started with Estevan Rael-Gálvez. Esteban, so let's first of all, how are you feeling tonight? What's going on?
Well, as you know, I had a booster a couple of days ago, so I'm moving through it. Yesterday was a little rough, but I'm getting there. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, great.
I'm delighted to be next to you as well.
And actually, in my screen, we're actually stacked. So.
Oh, we're stacked. Oh, well, okay.
Yeah. So tell me. So how is it that? Tell us your story. Like, what drew you into this work? Where do you come from?
I appreciate the opportunity, Chris. I should say, Bupu Wave, buenas tardes. Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be working with Little Globe. I've been part of the family. Chris mentioned that, but I love the way, I think it was Molly that put this up on the website, or someone did. I always credit Molly. It was probably a group effort, knowing Little Globe recognized me as a poet of the past, which I've always worn that badge. That's a badge that I wear very proudly. And so I've been part of Little Globe. So I just want to thank you for continuing. I've learned so much from the memory gathering and the storytelling and sharing from Little Globe over the years. So you thank me, Chris, but I also thank the family of Little Globe, which has been the community for a long time, and also Santa Fe Public Library. As you can see, I love books. And so they've shaped me from the very beginning. So I really appreciate these two amazing hosts that I get to be in conversation with. I always like to begin recognizing the breath, as Pueblo elders have always taught us. We recognize that wherever we go, our breath is always, we leave our breath behind us. And for me, that acknowledgement is simple and true about all the people who have always lived in this place, particularly its original and continuing stewards. But it's also an invitation to those of us who continue to do this work, whether it's sharing stories, gathering stories, listening to stories. We all participate in that breath making. And in that, I have been saying something like that for I don't know, 40 years. And I'm only 42, I think. So, but kidding. But it's also important. I think of this, Chris, in the past couple of years. I mean, not just the pandemic where breathing has become harder, but also, you know, the reckoning that has taken place, that actually has been taking place for so very long, or at least the call for a reckoning, where breathing, just the simple act of breathing has been hard for so many individuals and communities, and their breath being struck out. So I like to begin with that acknowledgement, if I may, Chris. Then let me say a little bit about myself. I also thank all of these individuals who have joined us tonight, and communities. I think I even saw someone from Oregon. So wonderful. I love that. We are a large community across a broad region globally. That's what Little Globe is all about. And so I think of how my core values have shaped me from the very beginning. I started out in a small village, two small villages that I always recognize, right on the state line of Colorado and New Mexico, straddling that border that was a political invention, but it, like, literally the state line divides our ranch in half. And so I never really recognized that. But I grew up in Costilla and in Cuesta, New Mexico. And I was raised by three individuals. My father, who is my parents, who I'm still blessed to have with me at the age of 94. And my dad is he's always been a rancher and a farmer. And he knew early on, though, that I was not drawn to that. I was never going to be a good farmer. I like to kid, but it's actually not true, though my dad might say it might be true, that I lost the sheep and lost the water a lot. But I'd like to think that that wasn't entirely true. But either way, we knew that I was not going to be a good farmer. But that man, among the many values that he taught me, including curiosity about the world, he taught me to use words as a way out of the village. And in other words, he believed in education. And he was always reading, still is, always. He's reading Don Quixote right now. I mean, not many people in the world have read Don Quixote, but now at the age of 94, he's doing that. He's curious about the world. He taught me that. My mom was a school teacher in Cuesta, Cerro, and Costilla, taught nearly 40 years. And for her, she was shaped very differently by the world. And for her, it was always important to be grounded and continue to live here. Whereas my dad wanted me to go out, my mom wanted me to stay in. And for her, it was about learning words to as a way back in. So she wanted me to train, but always come back, which I have eventually done. But I was raised by a third individual, my grandmother, who was probably the most remarkable storyteller, at least in my life, and she taught me things like this, that it was important to listen. The best storytellers, she would always say, are those who learn how to listen. And so she taught me about imagination. We would sit in the Resolana, on the porch in front of her house there in Cuesta, and she would talk to me about the people that came through the mountain. I mean, I was 5. So she was teaching me about imagination. And so all of these individuals taught me empathy, curiosity, imagination, the power of story. and it very much shaped my sense of being in the world. And it certainly shaped my interest in two things: my hunger for memory and my thirst for justice that I always saw as part of the same thing, just different sides of the coin, if you will. So I went off. I'll promise I'm almost done, Chris. We didn't want this to be a lecture, and here I am. But I went off. I finished my doctoral dissertation on slavery and its legacy, and then I became the state historian of New Mexico. Left academia, but I've maintained a few toes, maybe a foot in academia, but I've been a cultural practitioner ever since. I worked as a state historian for about a decade, and then went off and became the executive director of the National Hispanic Cultural Center, then went to DC, where I served as a senior vice president at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And I don't know, 6 or so years ago, I returned home and have started my own consulting firm. That's me.
Great. And there are so many beautiful things in all of that. I mean, of course, there is kind of the classic kind of narrative of what you've done, but where you come from. I guess one of the questions I have is how is it that where you came from helped to determine you decided to become a historian?
Our worldviews are always shaped, our sense of being and our interests are shaped by place. And certainly that place, as much as I wanted to get out of it, and the desire to leave. I don't romanticize these places. They've been romanticized, but I don't when you have, as I have, buried my only sibling because of the trauma that overcame him, you learn not to romanticize. When you see your cousins who are incarcerated, or it just, that shapes you. So as beautiful and powerful and resilient as these places are, they're also filled with trauma. Both of those things, the joys and the deep, deep sadness, shaped me. But it also made me want to leave, because I was curious in the world. My grandmother taught me to be interested in story, and I always wanted to tell stories. Went off to UC Berkeley, became an English major. Was shaped there by this incredible field that has struggled all of these decades of ethnic studies, and continues even in this era. I think of like the tension points, which are totally false, around critical race studies, but those studies shaped me, but I was always interested in pushing against those grains of the disciplines.
A couple of questions I have. One of the things is that you just said was that our sense of being is shaped by a sense of place, and I wonder, in some ways, for myself as a musician, one of the frustrations I have is that we have this notion that musicians are supposed to be professionals. You're supposed to go get trained and acquire the skills to be able to sort of have the permission of the community to stand up and play music. And in reality, what I've learned in many ways by being here in New Mexico is that it isn't that the world I was brought up in which you are given permission to do things in this world is actually one that separates us from place. It separates us from ourselves. It separates us from, as people who love hearing music, also people who make music. And I wonder if, in terms of story itself, that we live in this world of stories, that we are people who receive stories and we love stories, but the idea of actually becoming a storyteller as a member of our local community, like how does that work in terms of the discipline of anthropology and of history making? Like, how is it that this idea of participatory music making, participatory art making, participatory community is also part of participatory storytelling. And again, talking about it from your own personal perspective. You're here in New Mexico. You work, of course, across the country, but a lot of your work is here locally. And you're helping to tell stories that are personal to you. How is it that that helps to change the framework that we use when it comes to making history?
Chris, before I answer the question, if I may, of participatory storytelling, because I think that deserves its own space, if I may, I'd like to respond to a little bit about how I was shaped as a scholar, a little bit. And it's interesting that I think of you as a musician, working in jazz, and my work, and I can say more about that as well later, but my work, even though I've done many things, has been shaped by my working on gathering the stories of slavery. And I think and there's an impulse behind that I think can be framed by Ralph Ellison's words, right? So he taught, and he said, I was looking for that quote right now, the blues is an impulse to keep the painful details and episodes of a brutal experience alive in one's aching consciousness, to finger its jagged grain and to transcend it. And that, I mean, even before I knew that quote, that's what was my own impulse to story, and trying to understand, to keep those brutal experiences alive, because that's what I write about a lot. But also to find ways to touch it, finger its jagged grain, to touch it in a deep way. And eventually, if not to transcend it, to move through it, navigate through it. I mean, I'm trained. I'm trained by the disciplines of history and anthropology. You mentioned that. Both very, very different disciplines, and how they think about how they've been framed within working within communities. Anthropology, what's called the linguistic turn, it was about recognizing your place in that a relationship of who you work with, who you research. In history, there's this notion that has framed all of these disciplines that were born very much in the colonial enterprise to understand other people. I brought a very different take to that, particularly as a trained anthropologist. You know, anthropology, even though they had the discipline to actually be introspective about who you were as a scholar, collecting stories or whatever, but yet it has always been framed about going out there, somewhere else, not your community. And in that way, both the discipline of history and anthropology have been framed by this false notion of objectivity. And this notion of that anyone can be objective, which I even wrote in my dissertation, I think I even went on to say that that's a blatant lie that the disciplines have told. We all, Chris, as you know, we bring everything of who we are into the work that we do as story gatherers, story listeners. So to this question of participatory, we may not be honest about it. I have seen very few historians in my field ever acknowledge their relationship to the subjects that they study, even if they're just in books. Anthropology has been more honest about that, but it's still based on this notion of objectivity. And I think it's a false construct.
So we're talking about a subjective history gathering.
It's all subjective. We just have to be honest about it.
And by being honest about it, how does that change things? I mean, do we suddenly lose control over the the honorable position of the academy if we say we're not going to be objective, we're going to be, this is personal. We are part of that story. Do we lose power about how it is that story can affect narratives by saying it is subjective?
Can you say that again?
Yeah, I know. It's one of the things about being a musician is that I'm ultra subjective. And so sometimes I love taking some of these words and swimming around with them.
Yeah.
And I think that I've always loved playing with these ideas of subjective and objective. That, as you said, usually these disciplines are stories about other people. And I come from a background in a discipline where there is a certain professionalism about not including yourself in the story as the storyteller. We as documentary filmmakers will oftentimes interview somebody, but we'll have the cameras on the person we're speaking with, and then when we edit it, we remove the questions and the interviewer, and it looks like it's just a single person talking. And I always feel like there is a certain degree of dishonesty to that. And I think that, the question and what we're talking about with this Neighborhood Historians program is not even that, it's telling stories not just of other people within our own community, but it's even telling our own stories. It's telling the stories of our families. It's telling the stories of our next door neighbors. That we're talking about a very personal kind of storytelling process here. And so how do we do that in a way that sits alongside of all those great books that are behind you, in terms of providing our community with stories of this place that can be important elements to who we are today?
Sorry, my little dog. My partner just walked in. I coming back to the very notion of subjectivity, it's about recognizing that we are subjects in history. But I also get the impulse that you have, that even I have all the time. You want to fade into the background so that you allow the story that you're focusing on or gathering to actually be illuminated. But at the same time, if we remove the process of our engage, we're asking questions, right? We're framing the narrative, right? And as much as we try and take that out or allow the story to grow as it will and meander if it needs to, that at the same time, that we're still shaping it, right? The fact that there's someone in front of us who we're gathering a story from. And I think we have to recognize that it's being braided together at some level, and it becomes a conversation. In fact, when you and I were talking about why don't we just do this as a conversation, in a way that models a little bit about what we're talking about, right? That my knowing your love and your part of who you are, your very sense of being, your subjectivity is framed by you as a musician, immediately made me remember Ralph Ellison, who also has framed that quote that we often don't think about. Those historians like us, we think about it in terms of colonial studies, but we don't recognize its connection to music, musicology, and the musician. And it allowed me to make a connection to you, I think, in a very different way. So we're always being informed by that. And what I think I'm advocating for is that being informed and being recognizing how our conversation as story gatherers informs the story is important.
So I wonder, with that in mind, then, one of the things that's inspired this project is your own work with an array of others on that marvelous, the Manitos Community Memory Project, and which is itself also a similar kind of, it's a participatory history, an oral history project. I wonder if you could talk about that project, because I think it's extremely relevant to the project we're creating here.
Sure, I'm delighted to be able to do so. The Mellon Foundation reached out to communities nationally and said, we want to learn what it means to develop a community-based archive. They didn't impose any structure to that. I mean, it's a field that's been developing for many years now, community-based archiving, that is. But they were curious and interested in learning from communities, because what works in New Orleans may not work in Boyle Heights, California. What works in Boyle Heights may not work in Madison, Wisconsin, and certainly may not work in northern New Mexico. But they were curious and interested in supporting projects like this, to ask, what does it mean to develop a community-based archive? And we, in this project, was created and placed at New Mexico Highlands University in the Media Arts department. Students also curious about the world, but interested in the modern use of storytelling, media arts, and how that pairs with like very traditional ways of gathering and telling and sharing stories, but also developing a repository. And there were so many things that framed our interest in this. You know, archives and museums were also colonial constructs. And yet, I mean, that doesn't mean that many archives and museums and cultural institutions haven't been working hard against the grain to undo those colonial constructs and to be better and do better. But most of them it was a construct of gathering, extracting, and in many cases, those institutions, marginalized people have never seen themselves reflected in those institutions, even in books. So academia is also doesn't get off the hook here. Almost every institution has been part of that, and we often, as communities of color, don't see ourselves reflected in these institutions. So recognizing that, and recognizing as we were developing the proposal, which was developed by Miriam Longer, Mimi Roberts, and so many others who were contributing to sort of framing what this would be like, and recognizing all of the incredible work that had been done before. But we also recognized and placed this into our proposal. We recognized an arc to the project. We recognized that people have been losing things in these communities for a very long time. Land, language, water, even a sense of identity, right? Because of how, that's a whole other lecture, but losing a sense of who they were in all of its beauty and complexity, and sort of falling back on these binaries that continue to strain and constrain us, even in our language about how we talk about our identity, here and perhaps anywhere. But we also lost artifacts. We lost things, we lost photos, we lost stories. Academics would come in and collect without recognizing the importance of reciprocity, of giving back to the community. Cultural institutions, from the British Museum to local museums, took artifacts away. Maybe the impulse was preservation, but it was still lost to the community, right? And the intangible and the tangible alike were taken and lost. And yet we needed to recognize that, because those losses continue to frame how people think of themselves in the world, even their distrust for projects like this, right? And yet we believe in the principle that is embedded in restorative justice. That is to say, if we recognize extractive, we also believe that if we gather these, place them into one repository, that it can restore a sense of something of the loss, a sense of identity, a sense that we can start to see ourselves, reflected in these institutions.
So there's so much beautiful stuff to all that you're talking about here, and as you're saying it, one of the things is, that there has been so much that's lost, and I think for me, living in northern New Mexico these past 20 years, I have really learned about the consequences of that loss. There are people writing in the chats about various things, that it isn't just about not seeing oneself in the representation, but actually the negative representation. And that loss you speak of provokes those continuing feelings of one's identity, one's history, one's story, one's objects of being taken by somebody else for some other purpose. And then the counteracting side of it, or the goal, is this idea of restoration. Restoration of identity, restoration of self-determination and power. I wonder then, what is the process? I mean, so is the Menitos project, was its intent in some ways to create a system of restoration where maybe in some ways, if you could explain the nuts and bolts of the Manitos project, who is it, who are the historians, and what are they doing histories of? And is that process intended for restoration?
The nuts and bolts of it, just technically speaking, is our objective is to create a digital repository that people can go to, individuals from these communities of northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, and the diasporas of those communities can share whatever they feel comfortable sharing, whether that's a photograph, it's a story, whether it's whatever it is, right? And that we can place it into this digital repository. That's the nuts and bolts of it. Ultimately, our vision for it is that it will be a digital, it's not an actual, or it's not a tangible, right? So we're not collecting things. We don't even need to own them, right? We don't need to hold them necessarily. We're asking just to create a digital repository. The impulse that museums and libraries and archives have had is to actually collect. But what we're hoping to do is to collect a digital version of that. And we're struggling with all the same things that all of those institutions have struggled with. How do we do it in an ethical way so that people have a sense that they are participating in this process, that it's their archive? These are tough things. All institutions are struggling with this. I mean, what's interesting for the communities, the Indo-Hispano, Chicano, Mexicano, Nuevo Mexicano, whatever terms you use, including Manito, is that they're not protected in the same way as tribal communities are around these losses that have happened, that have been extracted legally. And yet we're still trying to develop a framework that addresses the ethical and the moral imperative around that. And yet still not getting caught up in that so much so that at the end of the day, we don't gather enough things so that people can start to see themselves reflected, because they're not seeing themselves reflected currently in many of the cultural institutions around the country and locally. And we just believe that it's still possible to create that restorative framework to see that, to actually And what we want this repository to do is to better inform our conversations about loss. I think, Chris, of like the incredible loss that people are feeling in Santa Fe and have been for like a long time. I don't want to put a number, decades, centuries, but people have been feeling that sense of loss, and it's pretty heightened right now. And I don't know. I envisioned this repository as at least informing that at a deeper level. My answers are way too long. I have to shorten them. Sorry.
My questions are almost as long. Okay, I'm going to try very hard to ask a short question, and we're getting such beautiful comments that people are saying. Yeah, the sense of grief is something I don't know. I mean, I experienced this a lot in Santa Fe. It's just the sense of grief that people play. We collaborated with the city on gathering stories in the historic districts on the historic east side from a whole array of folks who are of and from that place, many of whom have had to leave that place, but for whom that is their location of history and family and heritage, upbringing. Some people who came more recently, but others certainly who have been there for a longer period of time. And there was a consistent sense of grief and loss. You know, that people are proud of our town and proud of the fact that we have retained the architectural history of this place, but we have lost so much in the way of the human beings themselves who carry that culture, for whom that architecture is woven into their sense of place and identity, and that for the rest of us, for me coming from California, it's part of the richness of the life that I live here. But that sense of grief, I mean, you speak about how this archive is really intended to be kind of an animation. Its intention is not just a collection, but it's an animation of grief. It's an animation of identity. It's an opportunity for us as a community to see ourselves again. And maybe, you know, one of our objectives with this historic preservation program was for us to as we talk about the future of our town and how we retain the connection with the past here, that we're doing so really grounded in the human stories of this place, not just as a thing that a tourist might see and experience in a museum and say, oh, how wonderful people used to live a certain way, but instead to inform who we are today, that we are going to change the decisions we make about the future of this town if we are in that space of complexity that you spoke about. You know, the sense of who we are in all of its complexities, what you said earlier. That Santa Fe is rich because of its complexity, because we still have this connection to the past, unlike so many other places. And so, in a lot of ways, my experience of Santa Fe right now is that there's a lot of discomfort with the expression of the grief that comes to the surface in a lot of our public events. But without it, you know, maybe that discomfort is something that we need to celebrate. I'm not entirely sure, but I'm curious about what your perspective is in terms of a complex set of stories that contain anger and grief and history and so forth. How do we take such a complex thing and share it with the outside world in a way that doesn't simplify and it doesn't take advantage and make misuse of a collection of stories, but instead it helps us to see ourselves as we really are?
Yeah, I think
And by the way, that wasn't a very short question.
you know, mindful of shortness in terms of response too. I'm trying to, you know, one of my favorite authors, you know, I quote him all the time, Eduardo Galeano has taught me so much. Identity is no museum piece. And I'm not going to remember the whole thing. Identity is no museum piece. It instead reflects the synthesis of the contradictions of everyday life. I've totally butchered that. I'm so sorry, Eduardo. But you know, here's what I believe. I believe that story, not in, I mean, there's a way in which I think people outside of our field reduce that to fluff or something like that. But you know, there's a way in which our society generally reduces these things to binaries, to the lack of complexity. You've heard me say that Hispanos, there's not a single Hispano who actually can't trace their heritage to an indigenous person. And that's true. I mean, it's a little bit hyperbole for me to say it in that way, though it's also based on 30 years of research in that field, that I feel like I can almost get very close to saying that pretty definitively. But rather than the broad brushstrokes or hyperbole in that way, what has to happen is to tell those stories, to tell the individual stories about Sebastián Rodriguez, who lived in this village, who is an ancestor for many of us, whose parents were from Angola, right? That just to tell his story breaks through this false notion that we are three cultures. We actually never have been three cultures, ever. And even to hear or read about those three cultures, even in the paper recently, just drives me bonkers. But in order to break through that, we have to tell that individual story. And how Sebastián's son, Melchor, left Santa Fe and married into an indigenous community, the Brito family, and they settled and became the founders of the village of Trampas up north. And how those descendants of all of those people that lived in Trampas, who ended up populating Chimayo, Santa Cruz, Abiquiu, Cuesta, Costilla, all of these, but that individual story not only breaks through this notion of three cultures, but reveals that complexity. And then we have to go further. Well, how on earth is someone from Angola here? Well, let's tell the story of the African diaspora that was made possible by enslavement in Angola, that those people left in the transatlantic slave trade, not to Virginia, but to Veracruz, Mexico. And those people came up and became part of the communities that framed this community. And he lived here, died here, and was part of this community in that era, in the 1700s. I believe the individual stories, as we gather them, whether it's about Sebastián Rodriguez or families that were living here in the 70s, 80s, 90s, all of that becomes part of the stories that we have to continue to gather.
That's beautiful. One of our ambitions with this project is to carry the ideas and the notions of history and connection with this place into even those who have arrived last week. You know, that is history. Do we have? Are the only people who can tell history those who have this incredibly long connection to this place, or is there a role, a conversation through a lens of history about who's here now?
I mentioned early on that one of the things I learned from my grandma, from all three of them in a way, was empathy. And what does empathy have to do with storytelling? Empathy is trying to understand where someone else is coming from, whatever that is, not just a literal place, but where they're coming from in their sense of self. And it's hard. That's when this participatory storytelling really allows you to get to understand where someone else, what has framed their sense of being. But you can't suppress that and just, I mean, you and I have had these conversations with each other so beautifully that we think about like how what has shaped you and what has shaped me, and as we push each other, pull each other in different directions based on the stories that we're telling about that framing, whether it's our own individual lives or our ancestral beginnings, that we start to learn from each other. And then, again, we all have something to learn from each other, every single one of us. And yet, in the midst of that, we have to recognize where power sits, who gets to tell stories and who doesn't. And yet all of that context still has to surround these notions and the core values that frame the storytelling imperative, right? Including empathy.
Including empathy, yeah. Yeah, I think that's the beautiful thing is we're talking about empathy. And in my experience, one of the greatest activations of empathy is a story. And I love also, I don't know if you intended for this, but one of the things is when we created the title Presente, and I think actually it was Tomas Rivera who came up with the title, that the Presente has two different meanings. That there's Presente, which is somebody is present here today. There's also Presente as the past, the people of the past are present here today. Today is an acknowledgement of those who have helped to contribute to who we are today, but who are not with us here. And I think in a similar way, you said, a story is a great way to get to know where a person is coming from. And if somebody has moved here last week, for whatever reason, to hear their story and to be empathetically attached to their passage to coming here, and also how their own life history and their ancestors and the place they come from informs who they are today, that is where they're coming from. Saying, I don't understand where you're coming from with that. And in some ways, it's a beautiful way of saying who you are today comes from where you came from. And the story is the way to reveal that connection. I don't understand what you're doing. You're acting strangely. Where are you coming from right now? And then the person says, oh, you have to understand, whatever the story is that leads to that. And so in a lot of ways, I think the idea of this community archive is for us to understand where we all come from. It doesn't have to be coming from here. But who I am today here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, November 16th, my 20 years in Santa Fe, my upbringing in California, my experience as a jazz musician in New York, that all informs who I am tonight. And it's an important part of the story of who I carry. And maybe in some ways, if I can share that with you, you can be sympathetic, empathetic with me, and we can have a conversation that includes empathy. And maybe as a community of empathy, we can actually help to sit with some of this grief in a different way. And so this isn't just an archiving project. This isn't just a collection of stories because it's a nice thing to do. There's some real potent purposes to that. And part of my job as our interview tonight is to make sure we bring some of these to the surface. And so the question I have is that when you do find yourself in a moment of grief, when you do find yourself sitting with somebody and their grief affects you and you feel their grief, how is that a restorative moment? How is with the restoration you speak of? It's not extractive, it's restorative. How is it for me to have somebody hear my story? Somehow it gives me a sense of restoration.
What I immediately thought of was not necessarily a collection of a story, but I, as a historian, it's interesting. I'm starting a project with an organization in town, again, about slavery, my lifelong work. And we were sharing stories with one another and telling those stories. And one of the things that I shared was, this stuff is really hard. Collecting and telling and reading and writing about something as traumatic as slavery. Something that I say is probably one of the things that most tells us that we are human, unfortunately, because it reflects one of the things that humans have done to each other for maybe from the beginning of time. And as I read about these stories, I'm all like the individual, an ancestor of mine who lived in this town in the 1600s, Doña Inés, one of the first enslaved individuals of this land. There are moments that I just weep. And for me, it's a blood memory, because I'm here because of her ability to have survived that experience. And yet I tell someone asked me once, how can you deal with such trauma on a daily basis? Because for me, it's a daily basis and has been for a very long time. You absorb these stories and sometimes they break you apart. Right. There are moments when I'm not restored by gathering them. I'm actually broken apart. And every day I feel like I put myself back together again. But if I don't tell her story, it's irrevocably broken. It's gone. And they say that there are 3 deaths that we experience. And the last death is when we're not remembered at all. And so for me, when we translate that, sorry, Chris, to the just like gathering someone else's story, like when your community historians are gathering in a particular neighborhood, and you asked, how is that restorative? It's a process. It's not restorative in that instance. It becomes part of a process of, when we think of the archive, we're thinking of something much larger, a much larger repository. And we are all the broken pieces that get assembled therein. I mean, that sounds a little corny or whatever, but I think, I believe in that one story at a time starts to pull us back together again, even when it breaks us, that we are able to reassemble it.
Oh, that's beautiful.
That was all over the place, sorry.
No, I thought it was lovely. And, Anita Rodriguez says, bearing witness is the ultimate act of empathy. In psychology, just listening with the heart, it heals, validates. It is an act of restorative justice to really hear someone. And I think the thing is that, what you're talking about, that
Beautiful.
in some ways, we get so preoccupied with product. Oh, what's going to happen with this? What's going to be the end product? But in a lot of ways, maybe in some ways, just the creation of a program like this and saying we are going to be instigating a community storytelling project where people are going to be asking questions and gathering stories of their own families and neighborhoods, that it's actually more about the process of doing that we are modeling a community in which we are learning the skills of being able to do that hard listening in some cases. That, I wonder if in some ways that is the product of this, is for us as a community to have more tools of listening.
Yeah, I love that Anita's here in with us, and what you read that she said, it is a form of restorative justice. Thank you, Anita, for giving us those words. My comadre up north from Taos, that it really gives us and the listening is part of that. It's just part of that process. Beautifully said. I can't even repeat it. I'm trying not to look at the chat because I get distracted.
Yeah.
So
you just talk. I'll look at the chat, and also we will have a Q&A in a little bit. So let's step into talking a little bit about, well, actually one area that you and I had spoken about exploring, which I think kind of sits alongside of all this, is this notion of vulnerable carencia.
Yeah, Presente, thank you for explaining to our listeners out there about the project of Presente that we continue to unfold in a way no different than any other community archive that we're building. and recognizing, as you said, that we have some endpoints, and you heard me say a billion times that the process was every bit as important, sometimes more, and it certainly was. We asked our community, those participants, our community ensemble, and even the people who were listening to the community ensemble to be vulnerable. Querencia is this powerful sense of belonging to a place, belonging somewhere, to a people, to a place, to a time. But there's a vulnerability in doing so here and now. We were focusing on the really tough subject of gentrification. We didn't want to use that word. I'm sorry to even introduce it now, but we were struggling with words like that, about like housing and gentrification. And I mean, as you remember, our initial title was Ethical Redevelopment. So a terrible title. And it's true, when we entered into conversation with Tomas, he reminded us of the power of Presente, how it had been used in a political sense, but how it had been used to remember someone, to pass them back through our mind and heart. But it was also the dual meaning that I'm just repeating what you said, Chris, a slightly different way, but acknowledging there are still people in this community. There are still people struggling to make it. There are still people in our communities who are grieving from the loss and the losses that continue to face them on a daily basis. And so, but I don't remember who it was. Maybe it was Jordan Wax, who I think is with us as well, and others who introduced this wonderful term that we just reveled in, vulnerable querencia. We knew what querencia was, but we knew that it wasn't just about a love of place, but there's always a vulnerability to that. There's a vulnerability for people who are living on this edge of grief, of losing their rental home. And we wanted to touch that jagged grain, to finger it, as Ellison says. And so that's why we leaned into the very notion of vulnerable querencia, which is real.
So, I mean, one of the things you said earlier on was that, we're down here somewhere, that you as a child were infused through your family and curiosity about the world, empathy, story, imagination, and words. And one of the things that I think I've discovered through our friendship and through our working together is the beauty that you bring to even the definition of a word. So could you define for us the word querencia?
It's a love of place. Querencia, it comes from the word querer, which is love. And it's a love of place and a sense of belonging to that place. And so it's as simple as that, a real sense of belonging. That, and I think it's used in a deep way for many people who have belonged to a place for many generations. Not that you can't learn to love a place, but there's a depth to it as well, that I think we are trying to tap into. So it is a love of place.
And in some cases, it is a love of a place lost.
Yeah.
And it is the grief that sits along with that. And I mean, it's interesting because in some ways we are talking about this combined two words, vulnerable querencia. But I wonder if in some ways querencia implies vulnerability. Can you love something without already being vulnerable to it? Doesn't it require vulnerability? And in some ways, I think the animation of grief is an opportunity for vulnerability. And I think a story well told instigates a vulnerability in the listener such that we can feel empathy. You know,
Yeah,
maybe in some ways that's kind of what these are some of the inner workings of of storytelling that we're asking the people to help us to do with this project is to help to create an instigation of the vulnerability of the connection with people, with place, with ourselves, you know, which doesn't disclude, it isn't necessarily all happy stuff. It's painful stuff, the loss of place. We feel it so much here. You know, one of our wonderful hosts here, there's a couple quick things I want to say to those in the assembly. There are so many, the chat is just filled with beautiful questions and comments and so forth. And please, if you would like to include some of these in the Q&A, please click the Q&A button and insert it in there, because otherwise it'll get kind of lost in the scroll of chats. But one of the things I want to say is that Maria Sanchez Tucker, who is one of our hosts here tonight and who's the marvelous director of the Santa Fe Public Library, she said, "I had not realized the grief of this vulnerable carencia until losing my childhood home."
yeah, right,
I mean, that's it.
right.
And
These losses.
and I also have to say that, you know, one of the things is that for those of us who are in an institutional place of power, projects like this remind us to be vulnerable in our power. You know, that as we go about the hard choices of making decisions about this town, and as we go through the day-to-day, that vulnerability through the story of understanding our staff, understanding the next door neighbors who we're angry with, it changes the entire framework.
Sure.
Okay, so you and I had built a little set of questions, and I want to make sure we come through some of them. We've spoken a little bit about this inside out approach to storytelling, and again, I want to remind you that we're talking about a project in which extraordinary people who live as our neighbors and our fellow residents here in Santa Fe are the ones who are also gathering the stories. This is a different model than having a team of experts who have been trained in oral history gathering and best practices of archive building are doing this. Instead, we're saying that anybody at all, across linguistics, across histories, across connections to this place, that we want everybody to come forward and to help us to gather stories of their own immediate surroundings. This is an inside-out project. Can you
Yeah, I
speak a
love
little bit
this.
about that and about how that works?
Yeah, I love this model. As you know, I think it was framed a little bit off of what we're doing at the Manito project, but yeah, it goes back way back when I was a state historian. I developed a model. We started to implement it and then I left, but we have 33 counties. I hope I'm right about that. 33 counties. And I started to institute 33 county historians and tribal historians. And so it's a model that I began to frame out in New Mexico and wanted to even expand it further than that, particularly for the diaspora of New Mexicans that were living in other places. And so I held on to that model, a little bit of a federated model, if you will. And it came from this note. I mean, it was crazy when the statute read for the state historian that you were the leading authority of New Mexico history, which is preposterous. Preposterous. I never get to use that word, but it's preposterous to think of anyone having a single authority. And for me, I wanted to do everything I could to undo that notion. Because, and that's why I started the Office of the State Historian Scholars in Residence program. It's why I was leaning towards expanding and developing more fully the community-based historians. And it's why even the scholar-based program, there were three three types of scholarships that we supported: people working towards a graduate degree, people that held it, but my favorite of all, which legislators loved the most, was community-based historians, a mayordomo who wanted to gather stories about about that particular ditch, a tribal elder or a tribal anyone who was working to gather stories for their own community. And so that model continued to frame the work that I went forward with. So even now with the Manitos Community Memory Project, we have 21, 22, I think, we now call them community archivists, because we wanted to frame that they're helping gather these stories for the repository. So I love that you've taken this very notion working in neighborhoods. One of the things that we learned from the Culture Connects project is it's not, we often talk about Santa Fe as South Side, North Side. Remember, we used to do that. I don't do that anymore because even in the South Side, there are distinct neighborhoods radically different from one another, right? Income levels radically different in those sides of town. There are still pockets of people living on the East Side that are old families. My partner, the Rios family, continues to hold on, a vulnerable querencia there. And so it's so I love the model. Yes, it's perfect.
And I think I also want to say there's been a number of mentions in the chat about the fact that yes, there's history that's being gathered in terms of the long-term history of people in place here. But then also a really important aspect of the stories that we are gathering and that we are regarding as a part of the history project is the stories of those who have recently have migrated to this place. That our newer community members, our newer neighborhoods are part of this fabric of history of this place. Can you speak a little bit about that? How is it that somebody's history can be of and from this place if they've just arrived?
Well, I don't know that their history is of this place. They're bringing to this very what we started talking about earlier, about other places. Even to come here, you bring all that stuff with you. All of that, the ancestral, the experiences that you've had, that comes with you. It's also about respecting all of those. I mean, entering into this landscape, this neighborhood, some of the vulnerability means that you have to step back maybe. But again, it's a balancing act that we create. Yes, I think part of the project of the neighborhood historians is working to gather all of these stories. But as I said or hinted at, we have to recognize power relations in terms of what stories have been gathered or told or valued in the past means that many have been marginalized. It's in that context that we have to recognize what stories have not been told. And so I'm always there's always room to gather stories from everyone. And we have something to learn from everyone. But that notion is set in the context of what I just said.
Awesome. I also wondered, I'm going to get a little metaphysical here. One of the great disciplines of writing today, one of the great things that's entered into contemporary literature is science fiction. And some of my favorite books I've read recently have been science fiction books, but they're quite different than the old-fashioned style of science fiction. And there's a great poet who was a facilitator, an Irish poet named Padraig O'Toole from Ireland. He was one of the men who helped, through storytelling, to create what became the accord that resolved the war between the North and the South of Ireland. Right. And he says he says, I always thought science fiction was about the future. And he says, I realize now it's actually very much about the present. And in some ways, I wonder if this idea of past, present, and future, that we are most alive if we exist in all those frames at the same time. That who we are today is partly as a consequence of the past, but also where we're going is sort of the slingshot through us at the moment from the past. And that part of one's own history, part of the history of this place in this town, includes all of that complex interleaving of our past and how it passes through us today. And so that's the thing is that in some ways, like, and I think you're exactly right when it comes to that there's so much power in having the capability of telling the story. That those who have not classically told the story have been left out of the arenas of power. And for us to make a space by which all members of our community are telling their own history becomes a part of our own joint history and therefore the power of this place. I think for us it is the primary goal of this. It isn't to tell the story of Santa Fe, it's to tell the history of ourselves.
Yeah, that's really nice. I like that. I mean, so another of my favorite writers, I mean, I'm just so informed by writers, James Baldwin, who I've read every word that he's ever written. And I guess because of his sense of being in the world, his marginalizations, his own subjectivity, how he viewed the world and in the moment in which he was living. But he writes that history does not refer merely to the past. On the contrary, he writes, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us. We're unconsciously controlled by it. I'm hoping not to butcher this one. And in many ways, it literally is present in everything that we do, our history. That's a little bit of the blood memory I was referring to.
Yeah.
But it shapes us. Everything about our past shapes us. And I mean, that astute observer of the 20th century, James Baldwin, knew that painfully true. Whether it was in the United States or in Europe, he would find it in both places. But that holds true for many of us. And so and I really like your reflections about this the future as well, because even as we step into and live in the present and the everyday of the now, we are thinking of the future as well, or should be.
Yeah. And the danger is we live in this perpetual present.
Yeah.
We do. I mean, the social media age is one in which it's just this constant, like, what is the current moment? And the anxiety, I almost wonder if the anxiety that is so present and the fact that we're making really shallow decisions on behalf of many other people that isn't grounded and isn't honest about who we are and where we come from is really one of the fundamental dangers, And I think one of the great, for me, as an outsider living in Santa Fe, that has changed me is that there is the capability to there's the necessity to listen to one another, but there's also the necessity to participate by being honest about who we each are today and where we come from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So from your perspective then, Estevan, why is it important for us to gather stories in Santa Fe now?
It's always been important to gather stories, Chris. It's always been important, but it feels, because I forget how you just said that. So living in the now painfully, that it seems like more than ever, maybe we're being broken apart. I think about how education and religion have been the institutions in the past that did everything to break us apart, maybe put us back, for some people. But for me, I had to learn back to the core values of the things that shaped me. But now more than ever, you mentioned social media, that just the barrage of things on TV, the barrage of social media, which I every now and then I threaten to get off of. But I need to keep pushing the Manito Community Memory Project, so I stay on. But and because I want to tell certain stories, and I know that it has a certain reach, but it's the platforms have become as distracting as they can be helpful. And so there is so much grieving going on right now. I mean, I've lost count of the numbers of people because of COVID. And we can't forget the other diseases that continue to frame us, including depression, and the losses that we spoke of earlier in this community, in Taos and Española and everywhere. I believe that stories have that power to actually be restorative, coming back to what we were talking about earlier, and we need it now more than ever.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. And word at Little Globe, because we've been gatherers, we co-author stories with people, and this is our first time actually helping to build a community archive. And there was one question about where the archive will end up, and it'll be within the libraries. And in the Menitos, where will the archive end up with the Manito project?
On the World Wide Web. I have been working on digital projects since I was a state historian, believing that, recognizing not everyone has the privilege to actually come to Santa Fe, to live here, to park here, to be here for even an hour. I always like to support a tangible archive or place, but at the same time, it's true that there are connectivity issues in rural communities that are real, but I have been advocating for at least 20 years. There are more challenges to one place where an archive can live than a digital repository. Our communities are spread globally. There are internet cafes. There are more internet cafes that can give access than the challenge of going to a single place, as expensive as a place like Santa Fe is. So I will always advocate when I can, in spite of the challenges that digital continues to remain, though I was happy to see that the bill has an infrastructure for more connectivity. I hope that happens. But I will always advocate for placing it in a digital repository that you can access 24 hours from anywhere in the world, as long as you have connectivity.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So let's pivot if you're okay with that. I think we're going to be moving into our Q&A section of the evening.
Sure.
For those of you who have questions, please type them into the Q&A tab. I think that'll be the easiest way. We can also pull some of them from the chat. Estevan, if you actually want to go through the chat and scan through, because there's some beautiful things there too.
I'm overwhelmed with the beautiful things and complicated things.
We didn't have to plan this evening at all. We could just kind of be in dialogue with this amazing group of people. There's an interesting thing that's just going on in the chat, just talking about land ownership and borders, and I don't know if I'm conflating things, but people who have been here for a long time and still don't feel like they belong. I'm probably misstating that, or they're outsiders. Gosh, I hear this all the time. The people who regard this as having been a part of their universe for generations and centuries that that Santa Fe has changed around them and they don't belong, or alternatively that they're here anew and they don't have a sense of belonging. Like, how is it, like, what is the sense of belonging? And I think as Dylan says, how do we break that pattern? How do we break the sense of this fracture that you spoke about earlier? Is there a role in storytelling to helping to break that?
I mean, our field is storytelling, so I have to always lean back on what I know how to do. I know and believe that what has created a pathway for me out of a vulnerable querencia is to listen to other stories. You know, it's always shaped my sense of being in the world, whether I was wherever I was in the world, you know, and I truly believe that even the discomfort when people talk about being an outsider, I mean, that's the way I felt in a university. When I first went to UC Berkeley, I was a farm kid. I mean, I have felt uncomfortable in every single institution I've ever belonged in my entire life. I felt it. I was the first person of color to be hired at executive level at the National Trust. And I'm the only person to have been hired at that level so far. No, the second person. That's hard. That institution is over 100 years old. You know, so wherever we are, whether it's a community like Santa Fe or an institution, at some level, we're always navigating the vulnerability of belonging. And I, you know, but I still believe that even in those places, I had to find my ground, and I had to find common intersections, right? And so when I was sitting there with, you know, staff members who were living in South Carolina, some of my staff members were in, you know, I had to lean in and listen to those stories that felt familiar, even if they were so different. That helped me feel like I could navigate through that community. And just like I hope that they were learning from what I was talking about in terms of belonging to a world, or not feeling like I belonged, still feeling no matter what credential I hold, I will always walk into a room and feel like I don't belong. And yet finding my voice has been about finding my story. And so it grounds me when I walk in.
And how does that work? So at the National Historic Trust, you walk in, you don't have a sense of belonging. Is story some means for you to change that, such that you do have a greater sense of belonging?
It was my only way of belonging, to tell a story. Sometimes it was my only sense of being able to tell. I remember, you know, for a kid who has fought for getting out of being a farm boy for a long time, my very first meeting in front of the Board of Trustees of the National Trust, which is a very intimidating group, I remember someone asking me, well, how are you going to we need to make a lot of changes. How are you going to make those changes at the same time that you're assessing the situation? I don't know, it just came out of my mouth. And I said, I think about how my dad would have done this. If he would have had flat tires or had to change the tires on a vehicle, he would have gathered his cousins who would have hitched a trailer to the back of a pickup. I sound like I'm making up a country western song here, but hitched up a trailer he would have driven onto that trailer, they would have changed the tires. You figure out how to do it. So when I stepped into those places where I felt like I didn't belong, I gravitated always to what grounded me was my story. I probably sounded like some kid from northern New Mexico, but it's what I had to do. It was my only way of being able to tell a story, to actually make my dad a subject in history. And by doing that, it gave me a sense of being present in my own skin in that moment, I guess.
Sort of parallel to all of this stuff, Lena asks, Lena says, speaking from experience, having empathetic listening is not enough. How do you think the Jewish people would feel if all they got was sympathetic listening? It is not enough. Reparations are possible. And this reminds me of a moment where we had an opportunity to make a national PBS piece, which ended up being a film called Our Time Is Now. And we worked in high schools around the state, and it was stories of students. They were helping us to make a documentary film about the student experience of being in the public schools in New Mexico. And we went to one school, which we thought would be a great school, and the principal said, well, I really don't want that. And we said, well, why? And she said, what happens if a student comes to you and says, well, I'm going through this terrible stuff at home, I'm being abused by a family member, this and that. And I was like, well, it's important for us to then go to all of you and say this terrible thing is going on. It's important to respond to it. And she said, well, we just don't have the staffing to do so. And I was like, you need to have the staffing to do so. I mean, this is ridiculous. You don't want to hear the story because of the fact of it being convenient in terms of your own capabilities of responding. I suppose, from Little Globe's perspective, we are a story gathering and amplifying organization. And yet we work in direct collaboration with those who are working on the grassroots level and affecting public policy. Its policy is not our arena, and yet at the same time, without our partnerships to make that substantive mechanical change to the law that is reflective of the people who live here, it would just be a feel-good storytelling exercise. And so, Lena, your question is actually kind of more of almost a mission statement than anything else. It is. We do have a responsibility as a community to hear one another's stories, but then to respond to those stories. And at least in my feeling is that, another quick story is I know that Somos, a wonderful organization here in town representing the immigrant population throughout New Mexico, they have long used storytelling as a way to sort of rehumanize in some ways the negative predisposition that people have against the immigrant experience. And by doing so, they were very successful in changing a number of our state laws in terms of accommodating for people who are of undocumented status, in terms of education and healthcare and resources and voice in this community. And I think that it's so important to put those two things together. So, again, how is it that we animate these stories is a really important question for the community in terms of both power and policy.
Yeah, you went exactly where I went. No one said that empathetic storytelling is the only part of the equation. I articulated that it's my craft. We all have different work that we do in the world. Though I happen to, just like the wonderful example that you just gave, Chris, of how narrative is connected and can be connected to policymaking. I happen to have worked, certainly when I was the chair of the Cultural Properties Commission here in New Mexico, that you connect narrative to policy making. And that's really where we do this. Yesterday was a really good day in terms of the culmination of decades of work that went into gathering narrative that ultimately, hopefully, made a mark yesterday in terms of some level of protection for Chaco Canyon, in terms of the drilling. Decades of work that went into indigenous land, indigenous language preservation that culminated in policy decisions yesterday. There were a number of policy decisions, and it just takes, it's a process that we have to commit to. And we have to, collaboration is another thing I learned from my dad, especially, that we have to work together, understand what skills we bring to the table. And Somos un Pueblo is a great example of that. I mean, they are one good at understanding the power of empathy and narrative and how it plays, but they also don't work alone, right? They work with others who actually bring all of that to the table to effect policy that actually changes people's lives. So I will always advocate for the sliver and the imperative of empathetic storytelling or story gathering and story sharing, but why it's connected to other things like policy making and other issues.
Yeah, great. There are a bunch of questions coming in kind of in terms of nuts and bolts about some aspects of our program here. Shelley asks what criteria will be used to select the individuals that will be editing and compiling the stories. I think we're going to be looking at people's stories. We're going to be looking at their interest levels. This is a program where we're training people from the ground up, so there's no experience necessary. We are going to make it as open-ended as possible. We're also offering this both in terms of kind of a committed, kind of a paid position, as it were, but we're also looking for people to participate, to learn the skills and to do their own oral history gathering and to participate in terms of helping those stories go into the archive. And similarly, at Little Globe, we're also looking for people who will gather stories and help us to amplify those stories through our various projects that are coming up next year. So I would say anybody who's interested, please apply for the stipend positions on a formal basis, but also participate. Even for those who we have limited funds in terms of having a big crew, but we will be including people as much as possible and weaving people into our programs. So anybody who's interested in learning these skills and helping to tell the stories of the people around them, come and participate, and we will share with you the skills that we have and include your stories into our projects.
Chris, I'm looking at some of the questions as well, and I was trying to type an answer, but I don't know what I did.
Yeah, go ahead.
Ellen Osborne asked, what book on James Baldwin would you start with?
Yeah.
Here's a good one. The Price of the Ticket.
Yeah.
The book of essays, but it's easy to read because there's a bunch of essays. The Price of the Ticket is the title of one of his essays, but that book is really good because it gives you so much, Ellen. Let me see, since Chris has left me alone.
I've left because this is one of my favorite books.
Right, Another Country, really, really good.
Another Country is a beautiful book. Just a heartbreakingly gorgeous book. Yeah, he just continues to live and inspire, and he's shown up a bunch in the chat tonight too. Let's see. So, what venues, spaces, institutions do you suggest for sharing participatory stories? What are some of the out-of-the-box ways you've presented and shared stories with the broader public? So that's a great question because this is something that we're working really hard at Little Globe to do. Our commitment very much is to provide the tools for our own community members to tell their own stories in their own places. And classically we have worked with big venues like National PBS and New Mexico PBS. We've loved being in collaboration with the Lensic and having that formal gorgeous stage, and Estevan and I have done a number of projects there. But increasingly we want to keep the stories in the neighborhoods from which they came. And we've been exploring with the city an idea of a block party or a series of block parties, or to have block parties, story-based block parties in Santa Fe, where instead of sharing in an exterior venue like National PBS, that we would actually have people come to the neighborhoods where the stories come from. For us, we've also made this sort of hyper-local, collaborative, local TV show called Little Globe TV. We'll be doing episodes throughout this next year. It was created as a means for the community to tell its own stories during COVID, but it's furthermore kind of a way for Santa Fe to tell stories in general. And again, it's sort of hyper-local, it's ragtag and marvelous, it's co-authored, and so we will work in collaboration with people so that we can help them to tell their own stories. Estevan, do you have other out-of-the-box ways for people to share stories? I'm thinking about, in some ways, like the Photo Historias project you speak of a lot.
Yeah. I was looking for something I'm going to share in a little bit, but to that question of the Photo Historias is a project that we've started out at Little Globe as part of Presente to gather photos and place them around the community. I continue to think, again, though I know the museums in town would like to make this change, and maybe it's been made, but the statistics for museums, and that's probably anywhere, generally locals don't visit them, right? And so I'm always, wherever the museums are, whether it's that imperative or others, you want to move into the streets, out of your four walls. And so this incredible project, I didn't invent it at all, but in fact, when I worked with a group in San Antonio, Texas, who had a Photo Historia project on the west side of San Antonio, they did this. They gathered photos and they placed them on sides of buildings, on fences, and it was remarkable. Hundreds and hundreds of photos, and they're still there after decades. And so that's one way to actually push these stories out. We have one, I think, Katie, you'll remind me if you want to see what an example of that looks like. Where's that at, Katie? Can you help remind us?
That's at Shake Foundation.
Shake Foundation, thank you. So it's right by there, and it's a remarkable. So there are different ways that we can do that. That I think not so much of the gathering, that's amplifying the stories or amplifying the archive.
Good.
But I wanted to share part of the Manitos Community Memory Project, and thanks to the support of a grant last year from the National Endowment for the Humanities, we were able to put together cuadernos, gathering stories of the impact of the 1917-18 Spanish, so-called Spanish flu. There are three, one's about narrating death. I know, a little grim. Nombrando la muerte, naming death, and curandera. We've created icons, and also just a cuaderno, which is just a journal. Anyone who wants these, thanks to the one of our other sponsors tonight, the New Mexico Humanities Council, if you want one, I'm going to give you a link to sign on to, where you can actually, I want to make sure I'm giving the right link. You can sign in and your name onto a Google sheet and list anything that, list your address if you want us to send them to you. Sorry, that was so long to get out. That goes up.
Oh, there it is. So
We'll be happy to mail that to you.
So that's in the chat.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, I know we're running out of time quickly here, and I think Anna's going to come back in and help us to wrap up the evening. But is there anything else that you feel like we haven't said that you wanted to say, Estevan, before we do?
I know it's been a long sort of session for everyone, and I appreciate everyone taking the time. You know, just I'm honored to have been able to work and share stories tonight with my friend Chris Jonas. But I'm also honored the fact that each of you took 2 hours of your time this evening to listen and participate. And there are going to be a lot of wonderful ways in which we hope both the Manitos Community Memory Project and the Presente project and all of the work that is being done by the Santa Fe Public Library and Little Globe, that as those projects unfold, will invite people to share their stories. I think there were a couple of questions in there about how can we do this? And stay tuned, watch the social media or website as we share more ways in which people can participate.
That's great, and I think that if you go to the I think we'll probably paste again the link to the Santa Fe Public Library website for this, which will be updated as the project gets updated. I think Anna's going to come on and talk a little bit about what's immediately upcoming for this project. And so, but before doing so, I just want to say, Estevan, thank you so much. I know you got your booster shot, and so you're not feeling 100%, but you didn't act like it at all. And I'm just very grateful, as always, for the conversation. And so thank you, everybody, for being here. And I'm going to pass things over to Anna, who's going to wrap us up. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Rael-Gálvez, for talking with us tonight, for sharing your stories and insight. It was just amazing. Such a wonderful evening. I also want to thank Chris and Katie and everyone at Little Globe. And a huge shout out to my colleague, Lydia. She was the one who was running behind the scenes and making sure that everything went smoothly tonight. Thank you, Lydia. Oh, also thank you to our Spanish interpreters tonight, Denise and Sandra, for helping us out. We were just so grateful to have be a part of our talk tonight. I want to remind everyone that the recording for tonight will be in both English and Spanish on the library's YouTube channel in the next few days, so please go and check that out. And we would love for you to join us in the Neighborhood Historians Project. Again, we do have a workshop coming up September 11th from 1 to 4. And you can find the link to that, I think, in the chat. And if you can't find it there, then it's definitely on the Santa Fe Public Library calendar link. I think there it is in the chat. And as Chris mentioned, we do have some stipends. And we would love for you to apply and help us gather stories in the community. You can always find more information on all of these things on the Santa Fe Public Library website with Little Globe. Sign up for our newsletters, keep an eye on all of our social media, and hopefully we'll be seeing you guys out in the field helping us gather all these stories. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate everyone showing up. It was a great evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.